guys, and welcome back to my channel. So today we're going to talk about another very fascinating queen, Mary, Queen of Scots, Mary Stuart. So in one of my last videos we talked in details about Elizabeth I, the Tudor, the Virgin Queen, the Queen of the Golden Age, the Elizabethan age. And I asked you if you were interested eventually in talking about another incredible queen who was actually Mary, the Queen of Scots. They are often portrayed as two sides of the same coin, and it is true because they were so similar and so different at the same time. And this is very fascinating, and this is why there are so many stories and reinterpretation in literature, movies, fiction, and so on and so on. So you asked me to talk about Mary and to discover what was true and what isn't true, okay? What actually belongs to her story, to history, and what doesn't. So let's start saying that Mary was really a very strong woman, and there were many things that Elizabeth and Mary had in common. Even from a physical point of view, these two queens with red hair, it was absolutely, it was kind of a symbol of their family, because they actually belonged to the same family, even if Elizabeth was a Tudor and Mary was a Stuart, but they were relatives, they were cousins. And these very fiery women had also a very particular aspect. So one was obviously Protestant, Elizabeth, because she was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, so obviously she belonged to the Anglican Church. She was the embodiment of the Anglican Church. On the other side, Mary, Queen of Scots, was Catholic, okay, absolutely Catholic. Elizabeth had to struggle a lot to get her throne, basically, after the death of her sister, Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary, okay, so please don't get confused, okay. Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary, was Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon's daughter, and she was Elizabeth's sister, and she was the Queen of England before Elizabeth. Mary, Queen of Scots, she was Stuart, and she was just another person. I know there can be some confusion sometimes because they're both, their name is Mary, but they're two completely different persons. So, I was saying that Elizabeth had to struggle to get to her throne, while Mary became queen when she was an infant, Queen of Scotland, obviously. Elizabeth decided to renounce to her femininity, to remove the taint of her sex, to wear the crown of a king, not a queen. And she made herself an icon. She decided not to marry her people. On the other side, Queen Mary made a completely different decision. She made 3 times. She was able to give Scotland and England an heir, James, and her interpretation of femininity was completely different, because she was very admired as a woman, very refined, very feminine. At the same time, she was also a warrior. Okay, she could absolutely take a sword and go out to fight. So they were really different, but it is true that Mary could be seen as a counterpart of Elizabeth, and they are really two sides of the same coin, and Mary can be sort of an alter ego for Elizabeth. So let's start talking about Mary specifically. Mary, Queen of Scots, or Mary Stuart if you prefer. She was born in 1542 and she died in 1587. She became queen, as I said, as an infant. Okay, she was only a few days old, she was the daughter of King James V, Scotland, obviously, and his second wife, Marie de Guise. The family, the Guise, was very important, very influential at the time in Europe. As a Catholic family, first of all, and they had a strong influence in France at court. Okay, and Mary was a very strong figure. She was, Mary de Guise, so Mary's mother was a very strong figure, and she was even Mary's regent. Okay, for many years actually. She rejected completely a proposal that wasn't exactly a proposal, but was a very strong strategic move made by Henry VIII. So let's explain something. So basically, Mary's great-grandfather was Henry VII. Tudor, of course. So Henry VIII, Elizabeth's father, was actually her great uncle. This is why Mary had a claim to the throne, to the English throne. Okay, she had the right to have a claim to the throne, and so this is why Henry VIII decided or wanted her to marry Prince Edward. Prince Edward will be King Edward VI. In this way, Harry could make his throne stronger and avoid any threats, because obviously Mary could eventually in the future claim the throne, and that could endanger the Tudor family because she was actually a Stuart. In fact, at the castle in Edinburgh, not only, there is this symbol carved and painted, which is basically a rose and a thistle intertwined. Why? Because the rose was the symbol of England and more specifically of the Tudor family, and the thistle was the symbol of Scotland today as well. So the idea of intertwining them meant uniting these two countries and avoiding future threats and making the English throne stronger. But Marie de Guise and the nobles, the Catholic nobles in Scotland, rejected this proposal completely, both for religious reasons, because obviously Henry was Protestant and they were Catholic, and also for political reasons, because Scotland would have lost its power and independence. So Henry reacted, his way. We know that his reactions were always quite violent and very strong, and so he basically attacked Scotland. And this is a very, very bloody page of the Scottish history, because they tried to conquer the Edinburgh castle. The castle in Edinburgh is considered today, and it is true actually, one of the castles which had to face and resist to the greatest number of attacks and wars and sieges and so on in Europe. So also in this case, Henry tried to get to the castle. He couldn't actually, but the land around the castle in Edinburgh was destroyed. So many people died, and so this period is called the War of the Rough wooing, okay, because obviously this is a very well, it's a strong name, because obviously what Henry was trying to do wasn't a proposal, but it was a very strong strategic and political move. Anyway, as I said before, he was rejected, and Scotland could withstand his attacks, and Marie de Guise decided to send Mary away, and specifically to send her to France. So at the age of 5 years old, Mary left Scotland and started living in France at court, the Valois court. There she was promised to the Dauphin of France, Francis, okay, and Francis Valois was the son of Henri II and Caterina de' Medici. When they got actually married, Mary was only 15 years old and Francis was only 14 years old, so they were very, very young, but Francis could reign and didn't need a regent anyway. Unfortunately, he could reign for just 1 year and then he died, but during that year, Mary was Queen of Scotland and France, Queen Consort, obviously. Their marriage was so spectacular. It became famous all around Europe. It was at the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and it was and they were married by the Cardinal, the Archbishop of Rouen. And it was very, very rich, and there were so many people, and Mary herself in her jewelry and very rich French dresses was absolutely became sort of a myth, because everyone was talking about this amazing queen. They said that she was worth a kingdom, and she was so beautiful. She was very tall, which was strange at the time, this beautiful red hair and beautiful face, full of grace and very feminine. She looked even older than her age, while poor Francis actually looked younger. Francis de Valois was a very sick and weak kid, actually. He was always ill, and his diseases started when he was a kid. So he looked quite younger, and he couldn't move so much, and he was always dizzy with a runny nose, and Mary really towered over Francis, and this is why Henry, the king, Francis' father, asked Mary not to dance with Francis, because watching them together kind of diminished the image of the king, the future king, because Henry would then die quite soon, but it was diminishing Francis's figure or image, we can say so. So she made an excuse. She said she was sick, and she was excused eventually, but that was the real reason. Anyway, the two of them were very young, but really loved each other. It was a very genuine affection they felt for each other. Probably not the romantic love we often talk about or read about or we watch in movies or TV shows. They were also young, but maybe it was more of a brotherly love sometimes, or in some way. But they were really fond of each other. They grew up together, and so yes, we can say they actually loved each other. Unfortunately, as I said before, Francis was was sick, and for this reason he couldn't be that strong sovereign that is often portrayed on TV. He wasn't. He could reign without a regent, but the influence of Caterina d'Aragon, of the mother, was really strong. Absolutely, he was quite weak, and unfortunately they couldn't have a child because he couldn't. He suffered from a disease that was cryptorchidism, so it means that basically he had undescended testicles. For this reason, people imply that eventually they couldn't have a complete relationship. Anyway, they couldn't have children, this is for sure. As I said before, this incredibly stunning woman and this guy, okay, felt a real deep affection for one another, for each other, and they lived happy together. Mary wrote, while writing a letter to her mother, Marie de Guise, in Scotland, who was her regent by the time, she told that she was genuinely happy, and that the day of her marriage was the happiest of her life. As I said before, Francis became king, and his reign could last only 1 year. He died from a ear infection that probably affected the brain too. And some people now talk about meningitis. Others could say it was an otitis, which probably degenerated. So obviously we can't know that for sure, but he actually was very often feverish, and he died. Mary really looked after him during basically during their whole lives, but specifically in the last period of his life, she really looked after him and nursed him. And of course it was her role, but it was more than just being a wife or basically playing her role at the time at court. She was genuinely worried for him, and she really cared for him, and she really looked after him until the very last day of his life. And when he died, she was destroyed. She was really sad, and obviously it is because she genuinely loved him, and but many people say that probably part of her sadness and her desperation was also due to the fact that from that moment on she wasn't Queen of France anymore, and she had to find a solution. She had to find a place she belonged, because actually she didn't know Scotland at all. She'd never been there. She was she was the Queen of Scots, but Scots had never seen her. She was used to just another kind of life in France, and Scotland was living actually a very difficult period, because the Protestant part of the nobles, of the population, was taking control, and so her authority as a Catholic queen was endangered. Then her mother died, and basically her half-brother James took control, and he was supported by Protestant, and he supported Protestants too. So it was a very difficult situation actually for Mary. We can say that France protected, or tried to protect, Scotland for a long period without much of a success actually, but it was very expensive, and now after Francis' death there was no interest for France to protect Scotland anymore, and certainly Caterina de' Medici wouldn't have allowed that. Obviously it was another Catholic country, so they could fight, I mean, on the same side, but at the same time there was no reason to give money or I mean, part of the military forces to defend Scotland from England. After Francis, Charles became the Valois, obviously, his brother became king, and Mary wasn't Queen of France anymore. She needed a new husband, so she tried to understand what decision could be most strategic at the time. Basically, the problem was that Elizabeth was starting to consider her as a real enemy because of her claim to the English throne, and Mary was a threat. Okay, after the death of Mary I, the Tudor, who was a very Catholic queen, Elizabeth basically had to defend her throne and to basically make the Protestant part of her country stronger. And having as an alternative, we can say so, a Catholic queen could be extremely dangerous for her. And Elizabeth soon decided, as I said before, not to get married. That meant she couldn't have heirs. And that meant that, I mean, she was a woman reigning by herself. I mean, that wasn't easy to accept at the time. The Vatican was strongly against that. She was Protestant, she was a woman, she didn't have children, she didn't want to get married. I mean, that was absolutely unconventional. Mary, on the other side, she was Catholic, she wanted to get married eventually. Anyway, she was married, she didn't have children, but it wasn't her fault actually. And so basically there were a lot of Catholic forces who supported her, but she wasn't strong enough to actually fight against England, to go back all alone, or at least she thought that at first. And she tried to find out suitors, to find out possible new husbands. She considered a few different princes and kings and other sovereigns. She even considered Don Carlos. He was King Philip's son in Spain. And Spain, as I said before in my video about Elizabeth, was the strongest country at the time, economically and from a military point of view, the Invincible Armada. So they had a great influence on the continent, on France too. And so she considered him, but actually he was a very, well, difficult person with strange habits, and he was quite violent and had a few psychological problems, very unstable, so this wasn't the man for her. And so she, another particular moment was when Elizabeth herself proposed Lord Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, as Mary's husband. That was really strange, a strange move, because actually Dudley was her love, okay, the love of her life, obviously an unfulfilled love, an impossible love. They couldn't get married, and so it was a very unhappy love. And the fact that she proposed Dudley was actually provocation somehow. We don't know what could have happened if if Mary had accepted. For sure it would have sounded and looked as a provocation towards Elizabeth. On the other side, Elizabeth probably decided to send Dudley because she was so sure of his loyalty towards her, and so it could be a good way to control Mary and not to let her marry anyone who could be more dangerous for England. So there are many reasons there. Anyway, Mary didn't accept, and she decided to go back to Scotland alone. I mean, without husband, okay, by herself. She goes back to Scotland and she finds Protestants against her. Her brother, half-brother actually, James Stuart, the first Earl of Moray, led the Protestants against her mother, had led actually the Protestants against Marie de Guise, so Mary's mother. But when Mary arrived in Scotland, he actually supported her. He just lost, we can say so, her trust when he supported also John Knox. John Knox was a Calvinist and his interest was to destroy Mary. Mary was everything he hated. She was a woman, she was Catholic. He was trying to convince James that he could be at the head of the country. Mary was well aware of this threat, of John Knox's threat, and for Elizabeth didn't like him either, and so James and Mary drifted apart when she discovered that he had supported John Knox. Another reason, for them to drift apart was the fact, but in this case he was right, that James was opposing completely the marriage between Mary and Lord Darnley. Yes, she decided to marry again, at least, and her choice, okay, was Henry Stuart, and we all know him as Lord Darnley. Well, Lord Darnley was the grandson of Margaret Tudor. So basically, he was, another example of that rose and that thistle intertwined. Basically, marrying him, Mary's right or claim to the English throne became so much stronger. And this is the reason why marrying him was, would have made Elizabeth furious. I mean, she was infuriated when she got to know that Mary was going to marry Lord Darnley, because actually her claim to the throne, the English throne, I mean, became so much stronger. Darnley was a Tudor, okay, so he had the right to the throne, Mary did, and so the two of them together could be extremely dangerous, and they were Catholic, and in England there was still a very strong Catholic part of nobles, and the Vatican could have supported that marriage, and they were eventually having heirs. So all of that was so dangerous for Elizabeth. Anyway, as I said before, James of Moray, so Mary's brother, and Mary, we can say that they really drifted apart. Harry lost completely at first Mary's trust, because she actually questioned his loyalty. And so he fled to England. He was pardoned eventually, and he even became Mary's son's regent. And that son was the son of Mary, obviously, and Lord Darnley, whose name was, the son's name was actually James, as well as the uncle, and he was to become the King of Scotland, obviously, with the name of James the Sixth, but also after Elizabeth's death, he became King of England and Scotland with the name of James the First Stuart. So the child, in this case, I mean Mary and Lord Darnley's child, basically was so important, not just for the future of their own country, so for the future of Scotland, but also for the future of England. Okay, and he would have been the kid who could finally unite these two countries that had been fighting for such a long time. Well. Talking about that marriage between Mary and Darnley, she obviously decided to marry Darnley for political reasons, for the reasons I have just explained, but she was also in love with him at first, at least it seems so if we read what she wrote. But she changed her mind very soon. Her brother was so right. Darnley was ambitious, he was reckless, he was violent, he lived a very dissolute life, he wasn't loyal, his morality was terrible. And he created a lot of troubles at court and, well, in their marriage in general. In particular, the situation that generated very fast in 1566, when Darnley and well, some Protestant nobles decided to kill one of the people that Mary loved and trusted the most, and I'm talking about Davide Rizzio, or David Rizzio, or Rizzio, but the right pronunciation should be Rizzio because he was Italian from Piemonte, and he was the Italian secretary, Mary's Italian secretary, but he was also her friend, advisor, so they were very close, so close that well, people even talked about an eventual affair between the two, but we don't know that. I mean, this is just these are just assumptions, so nothing proved actually. Anyway, Darnley and these other nobles killed Davide Rizzio right in front of Mary, who was pregnant, and they stabbed Davide 56 times. So that was such a terrible, nasty murder, and it was a shock, obviously, for Mary as well. Obviously, they wanted to make an example of Davide Rizzio, and the violence of this murder changed Mary and changed, obviously, her opinion of Darnley had already changed. I mean, quite a long time before that, but after that the marriage was broken. And quite soon, so in 1567, Darnley was killed. He was killed right after an explosion, a quite mysterious explosion. No one have actually ever explained the reasons of this explosion in Kirklefield, which was near Edinburgh. He didn't die in the explosion, but right after, and so someone, well, there is the suggestion that Mary could eventually be involved, but her involvement is actually unclear. It's not. Also, in this case, it's nothing sure. So this is just something we can eventually suppose, but we don't know actually. What we know for sure is that 3 months later. Just 3 months later, in 1567, she married again for the third time, and this time she married James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. We know him as Bothwell. So Bothwell was the main suspect of Darnley's murder. I mean, physically murdering him. And he had a strong influence on the Queen. He was quite fascinating, but he was also very ambitious, and there are a few dark spots in his life and also in his relationship with Mary. She is supposed to have, she has, but he is suspected of an abduction, the abduction of Mary in Dunbar Castle. This is also quite mysterious, so this is another particular, quite dark and foggy page of Mary's life and Bothwell's life too. What we know for sure is that the Scottish nobility, also Catholic nobility, turned against Mary after her marriage with Bothwell. Because they didn't like Bothwell, because he was he was an outsider, and I said before he was very ambitious and very, we can say, strange personality, and also because the marriage happened only 3 months after Darnley's death, which looked a bit not so appropriate, we can say so. But obviously Bothwell and Mary knew each other, before Darnley's death, and he had this strong influence on her, and they had a very close relationship. Well, finally Bothwell was sent to exile, and because of this situation Mary was forced to abdicate. She was dethroned, she lost her throne, and her son James became the king of Scotland. As I said before, his regent was his uncle, so Mary's brother James. He became, as I said before, the king of Scotland with the name of James VI. Now, Mary was made prisoner in Lochlan Castle, and then she managed to flee to England, hoping for protection. At this time she didn't have a claim to the English throne anymore. She didn't want the English throne anymore. She even wrote a letter to Elizabeth, to her cousin, telling her that she basically entrusted her, Elizabeth, with her own son. So she asked her to protect and look after her son, and she gave her son as an English heir, as Elizabeth's heir, which made Elizabeth's throne so much stronger, because now she had the independence of a virgin queen as an icon and everything we've talked about, but at the same time she also had an heir. So this was very important for her throne. This was very important for the stability of the English monarchy. Mary decided to renounce to her right to the throne, so she wasn't a threat anymore, basically. She decided to, as I said before, to find shelter in England, but actually she was imprisoned there as well. And she was a prisoner in England, for 18 years. The reasons why Elizabeth decided to keep her prisoner were basically connected with the possible threat that could come from Mary, even if she wasn't plotting against Elizabeth. But there were so many Catholics in England, there was still so many, that they were plotting, to eliminate Elizabeth and to substitute Elizabeth with a Catholic monarch, a Catholic queen in this case. And unfortunately Mary received and also wrote a few letters to a man called Anthony Babington, and he was one of the men who were plotting against Elizabeth. Elizabeth's spies found out this relationship, these letters, and so in 15 86, Mary was actually brought to trial, and she was sentenced to death for treason in Northamptonshire. So she was executed in Fotheringhay Castle and buried in Peterborough Cathedral. She was then moved by her son James when he became King of England, James I Stuart, and then he moved Mary's grave to Westminster Abbey. So Mary died in 87, and she actually died alone after a long period of exile and imprisonment. So it was a very sad ending for a very strong queen, full of life, and this incredible and eventful, very eventful life. She tried all her life to properly meet Elizabeth, the queen, and the cousin Elizabeth, but she never managed to do that. Elizabeth didn't want to. There are some movies, like for example, the movie Mary Queen of Scots, the last one in 2018, where Saoirse Ronan is Mary Queen of Scots. There are films, movies that try to portray a meeting between the two queens. Well, we can say that people throughout history have imagined how this event could be, how this meeting could actually happen, how the two queens could actually react to facing each other, to watching themselves in the mirror, because one was the mirror of the other, and they reflected a sort of a reversed image of each other. This is quite interesting, but it is just fiction. I mean, beautiful scenes, whatever, but they're just fiction, because this fact never happened. The only thing that actually happened was Mary writing to Elizabeth about her son and her renouncing to the claim to the English throne. That happened, but their meeting never happened. There were movies, as I said before. One was in 1971, the other one is the one I've just mentioned. TV shows like Rain, for example. And there is a lot of, many stories are completely invented, and a few details are changed. I don't know why, because the original ones were more fascinating. For example, it is true that Mary had four maids, for ladies who actually lived with her in France when they grew up together, and some of them followed her to Scotland. But their names were Mary. I mean, all of them, were called Mary. In fact, they were called the Four Marys. Exactly as Mary Stuart, exactly as her mother, Marie de Guise. The Four Marys were Mary Fleming, Mary Seton, Mary Beaton, and Mary Livingstone. And they had an important role in Mary's life. I mean, Queen Mary's life. One of them, Mary Fleming, was even sent to the English court to talk with Elizabeth about the possibility to meet Mary, Queen Mary, and negotiating political stuff. So they had a very important role in Mary's life. And I don't know why they are removed. Sometimes they are removed, and some other times they are changed into someone else. Well, they were important figures, and they were very Catholic. They didn't have a strange affairs with Francis' father. No, that didn't happen. Another thing that didn't happen at all was Mary cheating on her husband or having other affairs while she was married to Francis. Absolutely not. She was extremely loyal. She was, as I said before, she loved him. There was a true and real affection. She was very young, and she was very Catholic, and they were married for such a short time, so there were no other affairs or something. That was a very affectionate relationship and a real marriage. Probably or certainly not the romantic marriage that fiction is talking about, always talking about, because obviously, as I said before, Francis wasn't this handsome, strong, sovereign man who fought for his queen. He couldn't, poor thing. But on the other side, they were fond of each other, and there was no reason to imagine anything else. And connected to this, I don't know why people are talking about an affair between Mary and Condé. This is also not true. Condé had a part in trying to tearing apart the Valois monarchy. He did. That was a very difficult situation in France as well. They had a lot of problems, Catholics against Protestants, exactly as it happened in England and in Scotland. It was the same in France. Condé was he tried actually to destroy the Valois family and to change the monarchy, but he really had no relationship with Mary. They probably barely knew each other, just for reasons at court, but nothing more than that. So there is no reason to think about it. So there are stuff that is completely invented. Of course, okay, it is fiction, so okay, we can accept that, but sometimes there is no reason actually to change facts, because as I said before, the reality can be more fascinating, and in this case there is a lot of fascinating material, and Mary was a fascinating woman, queen, and her relationships, her life at court in France, so sophisticated and rich and refined, and then her life in Scotland, so difficult. So she really had to be a soldier there. She really had to sometimes to handle a sword and go away with her army. So there are so many aspects of this multifaceted personality that are much more fascinating than the stories that are made up for television or something, which are good anyway, but okay, they're just something else. All right, so there could be so much more to say about Mary, about Elizabeth, about that incredible period of time in England and Scotland, but I think that I've told you, quite a lot about Mary today. I hope you have found this video interesting. Sometimes, if you want, we can focus on some historical figures who are particularly important in British history, maybe. If you found that interesting, please give me a like, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it. And if you think that you may eventually decide to support my channel, there is a PayPal address where you can eventually donate. You find it in the home page. Okay, there is the button, okay, the PayPal button, and the email address is add Maiora, which is the name of the channel, tutor, okay, all together, at gmail.com. So eventually. And thank you to all of you who have already done this. Thank you so very much for following me, and okay, I'll see you very, very soon with English literature, language, German literature, Italian language. Well, there is so much more I'd like to talk about with you. So thank you so very much, and see you very soon. Bye.